I want to talk about today is just a terminology thing. In this section, we're going to talk a lot about factoring things. I'll say sometimes here's a factor, and sometimes I'm going to say here's a zero. And they're very similar, but you need to know the difference. When I talk about a factor, it has an x in it. So a factor would be like x minus 4. A zero is just a single number that makes that equal 0. So if x minus 4 is the factor, what would be the 0 for that? 4. Okay, if my factor is x plus 3, then what would be the 0? -3. If my factor is x, what would be my 0? What makes x equal 0? Just 0. So a factor has an x in it. A 0 is just a number. So the majority of what we're doing today involves synthetic division, like we were working on yesterday. And we're going to be using that to break down some polynomials. Yesterday we ended with an example, and I said if something is a factor, what do you get for your remainder when you divide them? 0. Okay. So let's look at this example. So my function is 2x cubed minus x squared plus 2x minus 3. Part A, I want to know if x minus 1 is a factor. Okay, there are two ways of doing these problems. Can you give me one option? Yes. Remember yesterday I told you that the shortcut, if I want to know if this is a factor, all I really need is the remainder, right? And I told you yesterday, if you plug in the 0, you get your remainder. So what makes x minus 1 equal 0? 1. So all we really have to do is plug a 1 into my problem. And I get 0. So is it a yes or a no? Yes. The other option would have been to do synthetic division. The 1 would have been the number in the box, and then you just care about your remainder. So this is faster, but synthetic would also work. Okay, why don't you guys do B? Decide if x plus 2 is a factor. You guys get -27? So is this one a factor? No. All right. I might ask the same question, but slightly different. If I said, decide if this number is a 0. So if I want to know if 2 is a 0, what do I plug in? Just the 2. So when I give it to you with the x, you do the opposite of the number. If I just give you the number, that is what you plug in. That's the number I want to check. So for A, if I put a 2 in, and of course you guys don't have to show me quite this much work, but you can use your calculators if you need to. And we get 0. So my answer is for B, what do we plug in? -2. So -2 cubed would be -8 times 3/2, -12. -2 squared is 4, so -4. 3/2 times -2 is -3. And I get -19. So my answer on this one is no. Alright, so if I give you the problem with a factor, if it has the x, you do the opposite of the number. If I just give you the number, if I give you the 0, that's what you use. Okay, I want you guys to try a couple on your own before I move on to the next piece. So try these, decide if x plus 4 is a factor of either of those. Plug -4 in. What did you get for the first one? 0, so our answer is yes, it's a factor. What about the second one? Did anybody plug in? What'd you say?
Yeah, I was halfway through.
Okay, we'll keep going. Finish it then. Did you get on? Okay. Should be a -40. One thing to watch when you're plugging in, if you're putting in negatives, make sure you put them in parentheses. You know, make sure you type it in as a -4 and then put your fifth power on the outside just so you don't have problems. But when you plug in the -4, you should get -40, so that one is not a factor. Alright, can we handle problems like this? If I ask you if something is a 0 or a factor, you're just plugging it in and looking at your remainder, or you can do the full synthetic division and just look at the remainder, whatever's easier for you. Let's look at this problem. So I'm going to give you a polynomial. 2x cubed plus 5x squared minus x minus 6. The first thing I want us to do is graph this. So on your calculator, go to your y equals and type in your function. I want everybody doing this with me. If your Chromebook isn't charged, share with your person sitting next to you. Okay, if I'm asking you to use the graph to find the zeros, what are you looking for on your graph? Where are the zeros? So looking at your graph, where does it hit the x-axis? -2 and 1. Okay, let me ask you a question. If we think about yesterday, at the -2, our graph bounces. What does that tell me about the multiplicity? It's an even. So that one would have to be a multiplicity of 2 and a 1. Basically, -2 shows up as a 0 twice because it bounced off. So we just put M2. And then it crosses again at 1. Okay. If I ask you to find the solutions to P of x equals 0, what am I asking? If this thing equals 0, which I can get from the graph, isn't that the same thing as the zeros? It's just another way of asking the same question. The zeros are what makes the equation equal 0. So my answer is the same. -2, you could put the multiplicity 2 with it if you'd like, and the 1. Remember, it was an x cubed, so we said yesterday that meant it could have 3 zeros, and that's what we have. We have -2 shows up twice, and the 1. Those are the 3 zeros. List the linear factors. Factors have an x in them. So if -2 is a 0, what would my factor be? X plus 2. It was multiplicity 2, so it showed up twice, so I have an x plus 2, an x plus 2, and if 1 is a 0, it would be there on the Math Excel, you're going to have 1 or 2 problems exactly like this. So if you're jotting this down, you'll know exactly what you're doing on those problems. Write the factored form. That's just writing the factors multiplied together. So an x plus 2, you can write it twice if you want, or you could write it as x plus 2 squared, since it shows up twice. Either way is fine. So C just wanted us to list the factors. D, we're writing the actual factor form, so we multiply them together. Okay, where is P of x greater than 0? We're going to use our graph for that. So looking at our graph, I want to know when this polynomial is greater than 0, so above the x-axis. Okay, so if I look, all of this is below. At 1, it's equal to 0, and then after 1, it's positive the whole time, right? So we'll do an interval notation because we didn't have an equal to, we do a parenthesis. Starts at 1 and goes forever, 1 to infinity. Where is it less than 0? Okay, so it's less than 0 here, but we can't include when it equals 0 because I don't have an equal to. So I'm going to have to say from -infinity to -2. Union from -2 to 1. Again, the only reason I had to break at -2 is because there it equaled 0. It was on the x-axis, and I didn't have an equal to on this thing. Any questions on that? While we have a function on our calculator, I wanted to show you something. On the Math Excel from yesterday, there was a question about the intermediate value theorem, and we did one in class where we had to approximate. We kind of looked at our calculator and guessed what the 0 was, if you can't tell exactly. Your calculator will show you the exact number if you can't tell. So if it's like a decimal, we can't just look at it and know. And I wanted to show you how to do that. So let's say I was trying to guess this 0. Let's say it wasn't a 1 exactly, and I had to figure out what it was. You hit second. You guys do it on your calculator so you can make it work. Trace. And this is a list of everything your calculator will find for you. We're trying to find where it hits the x-axis, so that is a 0. So we're going to pick number 2. Okay. Then if you look at the bottom of your screen, it's asking you questions. It says left bound. Basically, this polynomial goes on forever. And if you just tell your calculator to search the whole thing, it will never stop because it's going to keep going forever. So we have to tell it start here and stop here. So if I'm trying to find the 1, you just have to be somewhere to the left. Doesn't really matter where. So I see my little cursor here. That's to the left. I'm just going to hit enter. You might have to move your cursor so it's somewhere to the left. It's before that point. Okay, then it's going to say right bound. You have to tell your calculator you can stop looking now. So I'm going to use my right arrow, and I'm going to go past that point. It doesn't matter how far past, but then I hit enter. If you see your calculator draws 2 little dashed lines, that tells you it's looking in between those lines. The last thing is guess. just hit enter. You're close enough, it'll find it anyway. And then it tells you my 0 is 1 here. But if it were a decimal, 1.345, your calculator can find that. So there's one that says to find the 0 to the nearest hundredth, so you'll have to use your calculator to estimate that. Any questions there? Let's look at this one. So I want to factor this polynomial. We have factored quadratics before. And we factor things where we could pull out a greatest common factor, where we could do box method, quadratic formula, that kind of thing. This is a cube, which I don't necessarily know how to factor. However, I am telling you that 5 is a 0. So we are going to start, we have to break this thing down, so we're going to start with synthetic division. I've basically given you the first thing. I said 5 divides this evenly. So let's do our synthetic with a 5. So remember, in synthetic you write your coefficients. If you have any missing powers of x, you put a 0 in place of those. What should I get for my remainder when I do this? 0. I already told you that. So if you don't, you've made a mistake. Go back and find it. Okay, so the first number comes all the way down. Multiply. 6 times 5 is 30. Add and we get negative 7. Multiply is negative 35. Add negative 3. Multiply negative 15 and add to 0. That's my remainder. This is my constant. This is x and x squared. So right now we have 6x squared minus 7x minus 3. I want you to factor. How would I factor this? So remember, the first term, the x squared goes in the first box. Constant goes in the bottom right. Those two things multiply to equal negative 18. And they have to add to equal the middle term, which was negative 7. So what would that be? So then we factor. 6x squared and negative 9x, we could pull out 2x and negative 3, 1. 6x squared and 2x, and negative 9x and negative 3. I'm almost done. I factored this quadratic. Right? My original was a cube. That tells me I really should have 3 parentheses. I have 2. What is my third parenthesis going to be? Yes. Why? Yeah, I gave you the first 0. I said that 5 was a 0, so you have to include that in your factored form. You always do it the opposite, x minus that number, so it would be an x minus 5. And we just factored that cube. This is all we're doing, the last piece today, so we'll do 1 or 2 more of these for sure, until we've got it. Do you guys want to start the next one on your own? Okay, so I've given you a polynomial. I'm telling you negative 3 is the first 0. Why don't you start that one? with synthetic with the -3? After your synthetic, did you guys have 6x squared plus x minus 1? Now we do box method. So we need two numbers that multiply to a -6 and add to a +1. So that would be a 3x, -2x. Remember, we can't do the shortcut because it's not a 1x squared. We need the full box. So this factors into 3x minus 1, 2x plus 1. What else do we need? Right. Because it was a -3, you always do the opposite sign. So it becomes x plus 3 for our third parenthesis. Is this okay? Let's do one more. Same idea, but I'm going to ask a slightly different question. Okay, so in the last one, I asked you to factor it. This time, I'm saying find the remaining zeros. What's the difference? A factor has what in it? X. A 0 is just a number. Okay, but I'm starting out the same way. I've given you the first 0. So where do we use that? Synthetic division. Since I gave you the 0, that's the number you use, so I put a 3. My coefficients are 1, -1, -4, and -6. Okay, so the 1 comes down, multiply to 3, add to 2, multiplies to 6, adds to 2, multiplies to 6, and adds to 0. So that's the remainder, the constant, x and x squared. Okay. Now we have to factor this. It's a 1x squared, so we could do the shortcut. What multiplies to 2 and adds to 2? Nothing. Okay, so think back to our quadratic days. If something didn't factor, how did you solve it? Quadratic formula. Okay. So, opposite of b would be a -2 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 2 squared, minus 4. A is 1, c is 2. All over 2a, so 2 times 1. Okay, so I get 4 minus 8, so that's a -2. What's the square root of -2? What do I have to take out of that? Okay, if I just asked for, hold on, that was 4 minus 8, wasn't it? That should be a 4 right there, I skipped a step. Got ahead of myself. That's a -4, so the square root of -4 would be 2i. So then if I divide them both by 2, we get -1 plus or minus I. I just said give me the remaining zeros, the rest of the zeros. Zeros are just the numbers, no x's, so that is my answer. Setup was the same, the only difference was how we answered it. Are there any questions here? So I think what I would like to do is stop and give you guys some time to start working on this stuff, and that way I can help you individually with what you need. So there are 2 Math Excel assignments open. Start with whichever one you want. You've got about 15 minutes today and the entire class period tomorrow.